My name is Amy Finch. I work in Mass DEP's Central Regional Office. Many of you I've probably interacted with. I've done some trainings in the past. You may have seen my trainings. I have to stand up. I have to use my hands. So you might see me moving around a little bit. Welcome everyone. Thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this training on such an important rule. Obviously, this is, as Bob mentioned, a rule that can be pretty complex and there's a lot of paperwork involved. We're going to try to demystify some of the paperwork and some of the steps involved in lead and copper sampling and the reporting of forms that is required. Also, I will be going over a lead and copper sampling checklist later. It will have the contact information for each region and who's handling lead and copper in each region. I would encourage people, if you have any questions at all during this process or you need any further help, we're always available for technical assistance. We're happy to, even though we're working remotely, we're happy to Zoom chat with you or to correspond over email or the phone to help you through any issues that you may be experiencing. So let's move right into this presentation. So my contact information is here on this front slide. If you have any questions that aren't answered, feel free to email me after the presentation. Let's go over our course objectives. First, we want to be able to understand the difference between the monitoring frequency and monitoring period. These are two terms that you'll hear often when we talk about lead and copper sampling, and there is a difference between those two terms, and we're going to clarify that for you. We're going to understand the criteria for frequency changes, what constitutes a reduction or increase in sampling frequency. We're going to review and understand all of the forms associated with lead and copper sampling round. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of paperwork, and we're going to demystify that paperwork here. We're going to review and understand the processes that should occur before, during, and after sampling. I like to think of lead and copper sampling round as a three-part procedure. There's the steps you must take before, the steps that occur during, and the steps that you must do after sampling. So we're going to try to break it down in those three steps to make it easier to comprehend what happens in each of those phases. We're going to try to understand the timeline for sampling, reporting, and filing of the required paperwork. There's a lot of timelines associated with lead and copper. It's not just as easy as the 10th day following the month or the monitoring period. There's other timelines for some of the paperwork that are not as easy to remember. We want to be able to correctly fill out and submit all the appropriate forms in the required timeframes to avoid any type of monitoring reporting violation and to make sure that we're doing everything in accordance with the regulations. Now, like I mentioned, there are two terms that we want to be familiar with: monitoring frequency and monitoring period. When we think about frequency, we want to ask ourselves, how often do I need to sample? So I think this is the easiest way to remember. Frequency, ask yourself, how often do I need to sample? Is it semi-annually, which is twice per year, which will be referred to as standard monitoring, annual, or triennial, which is once every 3 years. Annual and triennial sampling is what we refer to as reduced frequency. Now, my monitoring period. This is when do I need to collect my samples? So when you think of monitoring period, ask yourself, when do I need to collect my samples? Is it in Q2? Is it in Q3? Or is it in Q4? We're going to go over these monitoring periods in just a minute. Now, as I mentioned, semi-annual sampling is referred to as standard monitoring. It is the highest frequency of sampling, and it's for all new systems or anybody that has exceeded an action level exceedance. There are two monitoring periods per calendar year. The first monitoring period, which would be indicated as Q2 on your water quality sample schedule, actually refers to the first 6 months of the year. So if you are on semi-annual monitoring and you see lead and copper indicated as Q2 on your sample schedule, you have between January 1st and June 30th to monitor for lead and copper in that first round. The second round would be indicated as Q4 on your sampling schedule. This is the second 6 months of the year, which would be July 1st to December 31st. The reduced monitoring frequency that we mentioned would be annual and triennial sampling. Now, after a system has met the action level for both lead and copper in 2 consecutive semi-annual rounds, they would qualify for annual sampling. This monitoring is indicated as Q3 on your water quality sample schedule, but the monitoring period actually falls between June 1st and September 30th. Now, please note, MWRA samples have a special sampling period of July 1st to October 31st. So if you are an MWRA system, you are aware of that special sampling window of July 1st to October 31st. Triennial sampling also would appear as Q3 on your water quality sample schedule. This is for systems that have met action levels for both lead and copper in 3 consecutive annual rounds. Now, it is important to know your frequency. You want to make sure that you're following the most up-to-date water quality sample schedule for your system. I'm not sure if everybody's aware, but we have a document search tool now available on the mass.gov website. I'm going to show you how this works. Okay. This is a good time to point out that this is MassDEP's first Zoom virtual presentation. It actually took a team of people to put this together, believe it or not. And I just want to say thank you to the team. It was a really tremendous group effort. And hopefully the water suppliers, you give us feedback if you find that this format of presentation is working for you. Obviously, right now with the restrictions, this is what we have available at our fingertips, literally. So here is the public water supply document search. There's an introduction, the disclaimers, and there's instructions here. Basically, what you would do is, I'll type in a PWS ID number here, and I'll just pull up the first PWS retrieved documents. So when I type in a PWS number, you can either search by PWS ID number, or you can search by your PWS name if you are not aware of your ID number, and you hit retrieve documents. It's going to pull up some basic information on the system. And then if you continue to scroll down, you're going to find some documents for download. You'll have your certificate of registration, your water quality consumer competence report, if you're an NTNC, compliance monitoring schedule, etc. So you can click here on this link and download your water quality schedule, whatever the most recent version of that. It's updated very frequently. If you have lead and copper sampling on your water quality sampling schedule, which obviously all of you do, or you wouldn't be sitting through this presentation, another document that would be available in that document search tool would be your lead and copper sampling plan. Because I searched a TNC, it didn't show up, but if your system has lead and copper sampling on the plan, your lead and copper sampling plan document would be on that search tool. It has a very particular password. If you read here, it's the PWS ID followed by an underscore, followed by the annual finished water volume in millions of gallons, rounded to 3 digits, as reported on your most recent ASR. Now, the current ASRs are still being transferred over, so if you are looking for your plan now, you would be using the previous year's reported water volume. If you have any questions, please reach out to the regional office and we can walk you through your password. Now, this lead and copper sampling plan that's located on the document search, also there's been a bit of a delay in the updating of the plan. So sometimes the plans are not updated immediately. So I would always go by the most recent signed plan you have from your region. If there are any discrepancies between what you see on the document web search and what you have in your hand, please reach out to your regional office before sampling. And it's your responsibility to know the frequency and the number of samples required. All right, let's pause for a brief poll question. A system on annual sampling frequency shall collect samples during which monitoring period? Now we're talking about a non-MWRA system.
Is Q4 July 31st to December 31st?
July 1st to December 31st.
Yeah. Okay. The other
That
one
is
is,
for semi-annual sampling, that is the second semi-annual round of the year. So you think
Right.
of it, if I'm on semi-annual sampling, there's the first 6 months of the year and the second 6 months of the year.
okay, the next one is on the daycare facility that has the same service line as a school. Are the school samples sufficient for the daycare?
Okay, I think that's a Kathy question.
Yeah, if generally the answer is yes, but what I would say, what I advise people to do is to look at where they're sampling for in the school and what water the after school care would use. So in a situation where the after school care is only in the gym and they only use the water from the gym, and the regular daycare or the regular school sampling is done in the kitchen and the front office, the front hall bubbler or something like that, then I would say no. So if it truly reflects what those children are drinking, then it would be okay to not sample it and just say, well, we already sampled the school. But there are situations where in big facilities where they might even be possibly in a different building or something. So it's really a case-by-case thing for the operator to look at.
Okay, the last question is, what would cause a public water supply to lose their reduced monitoring status?
Okay, we're going to hold that question because we're going to get into that in just a minute.
Coming up shortly. Okay, gotcha.
Stay tuned, folks.
Okay, go ahead, Amy.
Okay, I think we're going to close this poll. So the answer is June 1st to September 30th. Annual sampling frequency is June 1st to September 30th. All right, monitoring frequency changes. These can happen for a number of reasons. It's not just about meeting the action level for lead and copper. If you have any changes in source water, whether it's a new source, the deepening of a well, installation of a jazz well seal, and so forth, that would constitute a monitoring frequency change. Also, any change in treatment would also constitute a frequency change. Another thing to take into consideration is overall system operations. If a system is on triennial sampling or annual sampling and it's observed during a sanitary survey inspection, poor maintenance of corrosion control treatment components or anything else that may be affecting the finished water, then the system can have their reduced frequency revoked. Now, let's get a little bit more involved in the process that would happen if a system was going to undergo a source or a chemical change. Any source, a new source addition or treatment change has the potential to impact corrosion control treatment, and therefore it would warrant more frequent monitoring. A system would be put back on to standard monitoring, which would be semi-annual for any changes, long-term changes in source or treatment, unless they provide DEP with a desktop or demonstration study. These studies would be reviewed and approved by DEP. Otherwise, the system would have to go back to standard monitoring, which would be the twice a year. Now, what do these studies include? They would need, at minimum, a description of the system, any system constraints, a total evaluation of the new treatment or source, monitoring data that shows that the finished water would not impact corrosion control, and justification for the selection of the new treatment or the source. Now, the timeline for submission of such a study would be at least 7 months before the planned installation date for source treatment for a large system, or 6 months for a small system. Mass DEP would evaluate these applications and provide any additional information, including a monitoring schedule, and they also would be consulting with EPA Region 1 on these approvals. Now, how many samples are required? You need to know how many samples are required because if you're on standard monitoring, you need to take the full amount of samples that are required in the regulations. But if you're on reduced monitoring, you would qualify for a one-time reduction in the number of sites if you contact Mass DEP and ask for such a reduction. This would require the submission of a new lead and copper sampling plan with the reduced number of sites on it. So you do not want to use a standard monitoring plan if you plan to and qualify for, plan to sample and qualify for the reduced monitoring frequency and number of sites. For example, if you're a system that samples 60 locations, then you are on standard monitoring. You passed 2 semi-annual rounds, and now you are gone on annual monitoring. Now that you are on annual monitoring, you have contacted Mass DEP and asked to reduce the number of sites by half. Now you are required to take 30 samples annually. You cannot just take the sampling plan that you had for 60 sites, choose 30 of those locations, and go do your sampling. You need to submit a new plan, which you're all experts on now, to Mass DEP for review and approval with those 30 sites that you plan on sampling. Now, typically, the water quality sample schedules are not updated to reflect the reduction in number of sites until the new sampling plan is actually approved. So keep that in mind when you're looking at your water quality sample schedule. When in doubt, always contact your regional office if you're confused about the number of samples that are required. So you saw this graphic before. You know that Mass DEP uses the population reported on the ASR to determine the number of samples that are required. You need to notify Mass DEP if your population crosses over a threshold to change the number of sites. And again, in the first column, you'll see the number of sites for standard monitoring. These are the systems that are on semi-annual sampling. And the number of sites for reduced monitoring, which is cut by half. But if you are a system serving less than 100 people, the minimum number of sites you always have to sample is 5. So that you can't do 2.5 if you're only sampling 5. Now, prior to sampling, here's where we're talking about what needs to be done before you even start to sample. This is where a lot of the legwork will benefit you later on in the process. Some of you may be aware that in my previous life before DEP, I did work for a contract operations company, and I have sent out my fair share of lead and copper bottles, filled out chains of custody, consumer notification letters, results, 90th percentile forms, and so forth. It really helps to be organized before that process starts. We have a very useful tool on the Mass DEP website called the Lead and Copper Sampling Checklist, or what we like to refer to as the Lead and Copper Sampling Checklist, which we will go over in detail in a little later in the presentation. It will outline all the steps and requirements for lead and copper sampling. It also has all the links to the forms that are involved in lead and copper sampling, which can be very useful. Now, you always want to check the Mass DEP website for the most updated forms and procedures. The link is here to the Mass DEP website. Kathy showed you what that website looks like. If you ever are in doubt on how to get there, if you Google Mass DEP lead and copper, it will bring you to the website. Oops. Now, make sure to review and gather all the necessary documentation prior to sampling. You want to be prepared. You do not want to wait till the last minute. This is not stuff that you should be thinking about on the 3rd week of September when your monitoring period ends September 30th. These are things you want to be considering and thinking about prior to the monitoring period even starting. Again, is your lead and copper sampling plan current? Obviously, you're all experts now on this because of Kathy's wonderful presentation, but this is the first question you should be asking yourself when you're getting your documentation ready. As a reminder, and it bears repeating, that the sampling plan must be approved prior to collecting samples. And you must submit your material survey if you have anything other than the Tier 1 sites. Okay, let's get ready to sample. We're going to use only our primary locations on our approved sampling plan, if possible. Again, the use of an alternative site is okay if the alternative site is of the same tier class and there was not a previous action level exceedance in the primary location that you are trying to use the alternative site to replace. I recommend reaching out to your Mass DEP regional office prior to making any changes in the use of an alternative site in case you're not fully aware of the history of the primary location that you're looking to substitute. You want to review the sampling instructions and chain of custody, which are all available on the Mass DEP website. We're going to go and look at these chains of custody instructions in more detail in just a few minutes. Now, for schools, you have to plan your sampling dates accordingly. Obviously, during this time especially, many schools are closed, but you need to sample when school is in session. If you have a large number of samples to take, say you're a system that needs to take 60 samples, sometimes it makes the task more manageable if you send out only 10 bottles at a time, or maybe 15 bottles at a time, so that you can keep track of a smaller number of bottles at one time. There are some caveats to this batching out of samples though, and we'll go over some of those. Let's take a minute here to talk about the LCCA samples. Now, these are the samples that are taken from the Form C on your sampling plan that Kathy went over in great detail. This LCCA stands for the Lead Contamination Control Act. This was established in 1988 to reduce lead in drinking water of schools and child care facilities. The LCCA samples apply to schools that are served by a PWS. So if you are a school that is a PWS, LCCA sampling does not apply to you under the lead and copper rule. You are required to collect 2 samples from 2 schools for each round. This is a mass regulation. And these schools would include the child care facilities like Kathy talked about. These samples are collected in a 250 milliliter bottle. Therefore, they do not count towards 90th percentile compliance. Now, everyone should be aware that lead and copper rule compliance is based on the 90th percentile of the sampling pool. But lead and copper samples for lead and copper rule are collected in 1 liter bottles. Therefore, these 250 milliliter bottles do not count towards those 90th percentile compliance calculations. It is important to designate LCCA on your chain of custody for these school and daycare samples. Again, not for schools that are PWSs, but when the data is uploaded via eDEP or it is put on your LCRC form, which is the state form for reporting the data, which we will go over in detail in just a few minutes, those LCCA samples will appear under a different designation under the LCCA sampling location on the form. Now, here's some details to consider. You need to make sure that the sample bottles you're sending out with the locations on them match your approved LCR sampling plan, which match the chain of custody that's included with the bottle, which match the chain of custody that's going to the lab, which match the lab results that you get back from the lab. Everything has to match. If you're sampling in batches, like we talked about, but sending the samples to the lab at the same time, you need to be aware that if the samples are not analyzed within 14 days, then they need to be acidified. So for example, if you're a system that's collecting 60 samples and you're gonna try to take the sampling in batches to make it more manageable, and you send out the first 10 bottles on July 1st, and you collect them the following week on July 8th, and then you send out the next sample bottles on July 8th, 10 bottles, and you collect them on July 15th. Now, and you're waiting to send all 60 bottles at the same time, you have to have those samples that were taken first analyzed within 14 days. You cannot hold all 60 bottles because the collection date will be greater than 14 days and those samples will not be valid. This could result in a potential monitoring reporting violation, so please be aware. Timely pickup is important because you sometimes don't know when the homeowner took the actual sample. Now, chains of custodies are really important. Mass DEP chains of custodies that accompany your sample bottles need to be checked for accuracy and adherence to the sampling protocol. This applies to both communities and NTNC. Every bottle needs to have a Mass DEP chain of custody that goes with it to make sure that the sample was taken correctly and according to the directions. We'll be going over these chains of custody in a little more detail and looking at them a little more closely in just a minute. It is your job to review the chains of custodies and accept or reject these samples prior to delivery to the lab. And if there is a sample that is rejected, you should be going back to that original sample location to try to obtain a compliance sample. If you can't obtain a compliance sample for that original location and you need to substitute a location, please contact Mass DEP Regional Office. Now, you still need to complete the chain of custody that's going to the lab when you're relinquishing the bottles for analysis. These Mass DEP chains of custodies that came back with each one of your bottles and the lab chain of custody should be kept together. And you need to retain these documents for 12 years. Some PWSs are not aware of the document retention time for chains of custody, but it is 12 years. Now let's pause for a second and take a quick poll question. True or false? Your LCCA samples should be included in your 90th percentile calculation. Remember, these are those samples taken in those 250 milliliter bottles. 2 taps at 2 schools per round for schools that are served by a public water system.
Hi, Bob.
And while we're waiting for the poll results, Bob, would you like to see
Yeah,
if
I
there's
got a
any
couple
chat
questions. Yeah.
Okay.
One seems to be a COVID question. Again, if schools weren't open during the monitoring period, will we have to resample once they are open?
So there's extensive information on the Mass DEP website about school closures during COVID, and any other specific questions can be emailed to the program director.
That's what I thought. Okay, number 15 question. What type of acid is used to preserve lead and copper sample? Remember, the laboratories are going to put the acid in, not
Correct.
you.
The laboratories need to acidify the samples, so
Yeah.
you need to send the bottles to the lab. You would not be acidifying them yourself.
Correct. And it is ultra pure nitric, yes. Okay, that's the only 2.
Okay, Bob, thank you. Looks like we're almost done with the poll. I remember to encourage people, you must answer the poll questions to get your TCHs, so please make sure that you're participating in all the polls. All right, the results are in. True or false, LCCA samples should be included in your 90th percentile calculation. The answer is false. These are samples collected in a 250 milliliter bottle and do not count towards your 90th percentile. So it looks like 85% of you got that one right. Okay, we've done our sampling. Now the fun begins. Let's do some paperwork. Sample results need to be submitted via EDEP if your lab uploads via EDEP, or on a form called the LCRC. Now, whether you are submitting data through EDEP upload, or your lab is submitting data on your behalf through the EDEP upload, or you're submitting the LCRC form, you are responsible to make sure that the locations on your approved lead and copper sampling plan match the data. You need to triple check this. So if data is submitted for 24 High Street and your sampling plan is 24 High Road, you're going to get a phone call from your regional office to ask why the information doesn't match, because 24 High Street is not an approved sampling location. Just picture a very diligent Mass DEP staffer going through each sample location and matching it to your sample plan, because that's what happens behind the scenes. Now, if you're sending hard copy data and not uploading via EDEP, like I mentioned, the method for that is the form LCRC. The LCRC form needs to be signed by the lab director. It does not get signed by the operator. Regardless of whether you are submitting data via EDEP or form LCRC, data must be received by Mass DEP no later than the 10th of the month following the monitoring period. Now, as we mentioned, compliance is based on the 90th percentile. So how do you figure out your 90th percentile calculations? And how do you report them? There are two forms available. One is Form LCRD for systems that are required to collect more than 5 samples. For systems that only collect 5 samples, they would use Form LCRE. And we're going to go over these forms in great detail to see the differences between the two, because there are both similarities and differences to the forms, but the 90th percentile is calculated different for each. Now, again, we're repeating, this must be an important point. Do not include LCA sampling to calculate your 90th percentile. Regardless of whether you submit data through EDEP or you submit the LCRC, every single public water system must submit a 90th percentile form by the 10th of the month following the monitoring period. Again, this is a form that you, the public water system, are filling out, not the lab. So it's your responsibility to take your data and then use that data, transpose it onto the 90th percentile form, which I'll show you how to do momentarily, and submit that document to Mass DEP. This form, LCRD or LCRE, is signed by you because you're the one filling it out. Now, what happens if I exceed the action level? First, take a deep breath. Then pick up the phone and contact your Mass DEP regional office. There are a lot of different requirements based on size of the system and whether or not you have corrosion control treatment or not. The corrective actions will vary based on these points. So if you contact Mass DEP regional office, we will walk you through the compliance requirements for an action level. Now keep in mind, an action level still requires consumer notification, in addition to the public education that's required under the action level exceedance. And we're going to go into great detail on consumer notification in just a minute here. So here we are, consumer notification. PWSs must provide the tap water monitoring results for anybody that collected lead and copper samples, the occupants of the homes and the schools and the child care facilities that are part of your monitoring program, for every sample, for every round. There's different templates and forms for homeowners versus schools versus NTNCs, and we're going to go over those different templates in detail. I encourage you to use those Mass DEP templates to make sure that you have all of the required language. So how does Mass DEP know that you completed this consumer notification? We have the consumer notification certification form. And you would send that into Mass DEP to let us know that you complied with the consumer notification requirements. Now, something to consider with consumer notification, there are two important deadlines. First, the notices that you're sending to the people that sampled have to be sent or posted, if you're an NTNC, within 30 days of receipt of the data. So you receive your data and you have 30 days to notify those homeowners or that NTNC or that school of their sampling results. The certification form that I was talking about that gets sent to Mass DEP to say that you completed notification to your consumers needs to be sent within 90 days of the end of the monitoring period. Now, failure to meet either of these two deadlines can result in a notice of noncompliance. Always check your letters for accuracy and the required content. So you want to make sure that you're putting the data correctly on each notice, and you want to make sure you're using the most recent version of the forms that are on the Mass DEP website, the templates that are located there, so that you have the required content for each notification. So this slide is a really nice timeline summary of all the dates we kind of just covered, because it's a lot to remember. We're going to go over each monitoring period and the associated timelines real quick here. So if you follow along with me, in Q2, your sampling monitoring period is January 1st to June 30th. Your data, along with your 90th percentile form, is due by July 10th to Mass DEP. You must perform your consumer notification within 30 days after the receipt of data. This timeline never changes no matter what your monitoring period is. It's always 30 days after the receipt of data. This consumer notice certification due to Mass DEP for Q2 samples is due September 28th. If you're sampling annually or triennial in Q3, your monitoring period is June 1st to September 30th. Your data and 90th percentile are due October 10th. Consumer notification, always 30 days after the receipt of data. The certification form would then be due to Mass DEP by December 29th. In Q4, you're looking at a July 1st to December 31st monitoring period. Your data and 90th percentile are due by January 10th of the following year. 30 days to perform your consumer notification from receipt of your data, and 90 days after the monitoring period to submit certification to Mass DEP. So it would be either March 31st, or if we're in a leap year, it's March 30th. Again, there'll be copies of the slides on the Mass DEP website, and I have this hanging in my cube so that I can easily reference and remember when the deadlines are. And again, if you exceeded the action level, contact your regional office who will walk you through the steps for the requirements based on population and treatment, etc. Okay, let's do a quick poll question. And Bob, while we post the poll question, if there's any questions that have come up on the chat, I'd be happy to take them now.
Okay, Amy, here they are. Okay, let's see. The first one is, let me get up here. Okay, we are currently sampling reduced, we currently are on reduced sampling. We test 10 sites every 3 years. We have a new source that's coming online this fall. Our next sampling is scheduled for the Q3 in 2021. Will we need to sample again, and would it be required to sample twice per year? So it's a new source online.
New source online will require the system to go back to semi-annual sampling, which will be reflected once the source is activated and approved. I'm not sure which region this is, but your regional office will be sending correspondence regarding that. And yes, you will go back to semi-annual sampling unless you had submitted a desktop study that was reviewed and approved by Mass DEP.
Okay, next one is, if you missed one of the polls, this is kind of a side question. If you missed one of the polls for one reason or other, you can contact Jessica Sabersky, and she will then make sure that you get the poll or get your attendance covered. So that's just an attendance issue on the poll. Another question I got is, it says, do you have fillable forms? I'm not quite sure what he means by that, or she means by that. I imagine all the forms on DEP are able to be used and entered on computer. You may have to enable the form. I know a couple of the chemical addition forms, the forms have to be enabled, but they certainly can be used.
So the forms are available as Word documents that can be typed and filled in.
Correct. Yep. Okay. That was
From
the only
Mass DEP website.
That's it for right now.
Great. Okay. Here's the results of our poll. Consumer notification of TAP results must be completed. The answer is 30 days. So some of you checked off 90 days. 90 days is for the certification to Mass DEP, but the TAP results must be completed within 30 days of receipt of the data. Now, some people answered 10. Certainly, if you did it within 10 days, you'd meet the regulation, but the actual reg is 30 days from receipt of the data. Thank you, everybody, for participating in the poll. Now we're going to get into some of the lead and copper forms. We're going to talk about them, how they're filled out, and some of the nuances of the forms. So let me pull up the first one here. And again, bear with us while we master this, master screen sharing. How's that?
Yeah, that's good.
Great. Okay. This is the lead and copper sampling checklist that we discussed. Now, the long version of the title is Lead and Copper Sampling Program Reminder for Public Water Suppliers, but that doesn't quite roll off the tongue as nicely as lead and copper sampling checklist. So we often refer to it as the checklist. And as you can see, it is literally a checklist. And I don't know about you, but there's something satisfying about going through a checklist and checking off all the boxes. So you can see that this form has links to all the other forms that we're going to be talking about. It is a really, really useful tool when you're trying to get ready for lead and copper sampling and to get your paperwork in line. We have the steps that are required before sampling, which we've covered in great detail, getting the updated forms and procedures, making sure your lead and copper sampling plan is up to date, that your materials survey has been completed and up to date, and so forth. You'll see that the nice link to the childcare sample sites is here that Kathy had showed you. Then during sampling, the reminder to ensure you that lead and copper samples are acidified within 14 days. The designation of LCC.
Yeah, I mean.
Sorry, I got some background noise there. Making sure that LCCA samples are designated as such on the chain of custody so the data is uploaded or reported correctly. And after sampling, submitting the results, the timeline for submitting results, and so forth. Not including the LCCA results in the 90th percentile calculations. Basically, it's like a great reminder. So if you can't remember everything that we talked about during this presentation, but you have this sampling checklist, you're well on your way to a very successful and compliant round of lead and copper sampling, hopefully. It's quite possibly my favorite document on the Mass DEP website, if one could just choose one favorite. Now, the chains of custodies that would go out with your sample bottles. Here is the example of the homeowner lead and copper chain of custody for community water systems. I'll just point out, everybody can see the chain of custody, okay? Okay. So the chain of custody is first, and then the directions are second. So just make sure if you're looking for the directions themselves, they are on the second page. You'll see that the chain of custody here has the basic information that's going to be completed by the person taking the sample, the address, the name, email. I would try to get an email or a phone number in case you have to contact them afterwards. I know it says optional here, but really helps to have contact information for the person taking the sample. They're going to ask questions like, was there any recent plumbing? Do you have a whole house filter? For reasons that would disqualify the sample that's being collected. It's going to ask the sample location, what time the water was last used, and what time the sample was drawn so that you can figure out what the stagnation time was. They're going to sign that form and they're going to return it with their bottle. Then you as the public water system are responsible to either accept or reject the sample. So the reasons for rejection you can see here are collected at the wrong location, not filled out properly, improper standing time, plumbing modification. So like if they collected a sample, they said they took it from outside Silcock or something, that is not a kitchen or a bathroom sink. Improper standing time, they only shut the water off for 2 hours. It's a minimum of 6 hour stagnation time. As all of you are probably aware, but if you are not, you will see that the instructions here spell out no pre-flushing, 6-hour minimum stagnation period, do not use water with a treatment device, use only cold water, do not remove the aerator, and so forth, all of these requirements. I find it really helpful, and this is just a little tip, when you're getting ready, the before sampling phase, and you have your participants. I find it really helps to send these instructions and the chain of custody to the homeowner with perhaps a cover letter that says, you know, please become familiar with this procedure. This is what you'll be doing when you receive your sample bottle, and this is the form that you'll need to fill out. That way, if there's any questions, they can contact you before they get their bottle, and you'll have plenty of time to address any concerns. The more organized you are, and the more time you allow yourself to get all the bottles prepared and sent out and contact and have a rapport with your sampling participants, usually the smoother the lead and copper sampling event goes. So that's the homeowner chain of custody. Similarly, we have an NTNC chain of custody. So here's the NTNC chain of custody. It looks very similar. It needs to be accompany every bottle that's sampled in an NTNC. So if you're looking at an office building and you're taking 10 samples, you need 10 of these forms, one with each bottle. They get filled out the same way. You probably would have like a facilities person or someone taking the samples. Perhaps the operator themselves, if it's a contract operator, is taking the samples. Whoever's taking the sample would fill this out to make sure that sample protocol is being adhered with. And again, the certified operator collecting all the bottles would be checking up to make sure the sample is accepted, or if there's reason for rejected, that it's properly rejected. And again, the sample directions are on the second page here. They look very similar to the homeowner sample directions. Okay. Bear with me here while we get to the next form. All right, we've taken our samples. Now we are going to report our data. Here is the LCRC form for those of us that do not upload via eDEP. If you upload via eDEP, then you do not need to have this LCRC form, but it is important that you realize what it is in case for some reason, you know, eDEP upload is not available and your lab will need to submit a hard copy form. You can see the top of the form has basic information for PWSID, city, town, and so forth. The lab is going to be filling out all of this information about the certification, Massachusetts certification number, and so forth. Your sample locations will be listed here. You are double, triple checking that these sample locations exactly match what is on your approved lead and copper sampling plan. If your approved plan, just give an example off of an NTNC approved plan, says office building B, room 205, sink A, then this form better say office building B, room 205, sink A. Exactly. Can't just say building B. We would have no idea that that sample was taken from the approved location. Again, the lab is filling this out with the lead and copper sampling results. You'll see the collection date and the date analyzed here. There'll be assigned sample ID numbers. Now, we talked about LCCA samples, that they're not included in the 90th percentile calculation. Those school results samples for the 250 milliliter bottles, the 2 taps from 2 schools, get reported on the bottom of this form here. That's why there's 4 slots. And you can see, if you read the fine print, that these results are not included in the 90th percentile, and it tells you right here. So it's, honestly, if you start reading some of the fine print on MassDEP forms, you'll be amazed at how much useful information is there. I encourage everybody to read the fine print. This form is signed by the primary lab director, dated and sent to MassDEP no later than 10 days after the end of the monitoring period. Now let's move on to the 90th percentile forms, because as we know, 90th percentile is compliance is based on 90th percentile. So here is your form LCRD. This is for those systems that collect more than 5 samples. Again, your PWS ID name information is at the top of the form. You, the PWS, are filling out this form. So you are well aware of what your sampling frequency is here because we covered sampling frequency in great detail. And again, if you read this small font print here, there are directions on how to fill this form out. Place your lead results in ascending order from lowest to highest value. Repeat for copper results. So if you have a large number of samples, I'm just going to give you a little hint here. If you are trying to report 60 samples on this form, it really helps to put those samples, to type them into an Excel document and let Excel sort them from in ascending order for you. Unless you're really good at putting numbers in order, Excel can be a very useful tool here to help you put the numbers in proper order. So ascending order is lowest to highest value. Now, let's look at one scenario. Say a public water system collects 40 samples, and it's getting close to the end of the monitoring period, and they have gotten 39 of their bottles back. They're starting to get nervous and say, I don't know if that 40th person is going to sample, they're not responding to me. Okay, we're going to contact Mass DEP, we're going to use an alternative site. So we send out a 41st bottle. Bottle number 41 goes to an alternative site. Lo and behold, a few days later, you get a call back from both sample site number 40 and sample site number 41. Both of them took the sample. Now what do you do? Well, the answer is that you must include all data, all samples received from approved locations on your 90th percentile form. So you would have 41 sample results here. When you get to the bottom of the form, you'll notice step 2 talks about the bottom of the form here. And this is where that information is relayed. My system was required to collect, in this instance, 40 lead and copper samples. My system collected 41 lead and copper samples. So the total number of samples collected was 41. How you calculate your 90th percentile is you multiply that number by 0.9. Now, in the instance of 41 samples, times 0.9 is 36.9. You would round up to the nearest whole number, and your compliance would be based on the 37th sample. So in ascending order, whatever appears in box 37 would get placed down here on the bottom of the form. So you would repeat the same process for copper. Then you would compare the lead result to the action level, the copper result to the action level, and determine if your system is in compliance. If the level is at or below, so even if box 37 said 0.015, you would be in compliance because compliance is at or below the action level. You would check off the first box here under the certification, and the same for copper. If you exceeded the lead action level, you'd be calling your Mass DEP regional office, and you'd also be indicating that at the bottom of the form here. And you would fill out how many samples in the above table exceeded the action level of 0.015 milligrams per liter for lead and 1.3 milligrams per liter for copper. Important, do not forget to sign this form. This form is signed by the PWS. Now, if you are a system that takes more than 60 samples, you will need more than 1 page of this form, and you can indicate down the bottom here that this is page 1 of 2, page 2 of 2, so forth. What if you only collect 5 samples? Well, then you would use form LCR E, which I will pull up for you here. Here's form LCR-E for these small systems that only collect 5 samples. Looks similar, but there's a little bit of a difference when you're computing your 90th percentile. Again, the top of the form looks very, very similar. You would do the exact same activity of listing your lead and copper results in ascending order and placing them in the table. Now, here are the directions. The calculation is a little bit different. It's specified here in step 2, and it also walks you through the calculation down here on the bottom of the page. You would take the value of your 4th and 5th number, add them together, and then divide by 2 to get your 90th percentile, which would be placed here for lead and here for copper. You would fill out the bottom of the form the same way, comparing your 90th percentile value to the action level for each contaminant and indicating whether your system was at or below the action level. You will sign the form and send it into Mass DEP no later than the 10th of the month following the monitoring period. We've sent in our data, we've received our data, we need to do consumer notification. Like I mentioned, there are 3 different templates for consumer notification to the participants. This first one is the letter that would go to the homeowners. Now you can see at the top of this form, there is a header with the little attention public water system message. Feel free to delete this header. You can replace it with your own letterhead or information on the public water system if you wish. But don't delete anything else on the form. You're going to fill in your PWS name, town ID number. You're going to fill in the customer's name if you have it. You're going to put the address, the date that the sample was collected, and you're going to give each person that collected a sample their individual results for their lead and copper sampling. And then you're going to check off whether the result is above or at or below the action level. The rest of the form contains pertinent information about lead and copper sampling and required language under the rule. It also has important definitions at the bottom of the page. So where I mentioned that you may delete the header, you may not delete this footer because it contains the 2 definitions that are required under the consumer notification regulation. There are links that the homeowner or consumer can go to for more information on lead in drinking water. That is the template for homeowners that have sampled. Now for your 2 taps at 2 schools, you have a different template. And as you can see, it looks kind of similar, but there's some other language that's here pertinent to schools, and you'll see that there's a spot here to put your 2 taps from this school. So if you took 2 taps from 2 schools, you will have filled out 2 of these forms and sent one off to each school. You're sending it to the school superintendent. You're going to fill out the top of the form. You're going to put the PWS name. You're going to put the location that the sample was collected. Say it was taken from room 205 bubbler and kitchen sink, right-hand sink, so forth, wherever the samples were collected from the school, the LCCA samples, and you will fill in the results and indicate whether or not they are above or at or below the copper action or lead action level. And then here's all that required language, and you would fill out the bottom of the form with your contact information. Again, do not delete this footer that's at the very bottom of the page in the fine print. It contains those 2 required definitions under the consumer notification rule. Now, what if you are a school that is a PWS? Well, that would make you an NTNC. And for an NTNC, we have a special template. And it has an instructions page. So feel free on your spare time to read through, if you're an NTNC, to read through these detailed instructions. But I will just bring you to the template. Now, For NTNCs, you have two options. You can either list every single sampling location and their result in the table at the top, or you may just report the 90th percentile from either your LCRD or LCRE form, depending on how many samples you collected, and attach all the analytical results of all the taps to this form, which would be posted in your facility. Whichever one you choose, you're just going to delete the one that you're not using. So it tells you here, select between the two following options and check the box that applies, delete the option that's not selected. If you choose option 1 here to list all of the sampling locations and their results, and you have more than 5 locations that you're reporting, if you tab through the table, it will add lines. If you're having any problems, reach out to your Mass DEP regional office and we can help you and modify the template for you. Now, it is important that if you are only reporting the 90th percentile on your posting, that you attach the data for all of the taps, all of the samples collected in that building. Again, you have all this standard language. Do not delete the footers with the required definitions, and make sure to include your PWS contact name, phone number. Lastly, we've done our consumer notification. We need to let DEP know that we did it, and we did it right, and we did it in the proper time frame. So how do we do this? We send in our consumer notification certification form. Here we go. This is the form that is due 90 days, within 90 days of the end of the monitoring period. But listen, folks, let's just send the form in as soon as we're done so we don't forget. Because one of the worst things is to have to issue a monitoring reporting violation for a missed piece of paper, even if you did the consumer notification completely correct and within the time frame. If you don't send the certification form in, there's no way for Mass DEP to know that it was done timely and properly. This form has been recently updated. So this is why if you haven't sampled copper and lead in, like, say 3 years, and you're going to do it now, it's important to download these forms from the Mass DEP website. There's been some changes. The top of the form, you fill out your Mass DEP, your PWS information, so forth. For community water systems, you're going to be filling out section B to report your residents' consumer notice, and that for the schools. If you're a school that is a PWS or an NTNC building, you'll be filling out section C. You want to make sure that you put the proper year that you were sampling, and you want to check off your approved monitoring period. Now, you'll see that July 1st to October 31st special period that the MWRA sites use. That needs to be approved by Mass DEP. The majority of you are looking at one of these 3 monitoring periods. You want to indicate the number of 1-liter samples that were collected. So if you were required to sample 40 sites, you collected 40 sites, or say you got some extra ones, you got 42 sites, you would say 42 here. The number of samples that you collected for LCCA, if you are a community water system that serves a school, the minimum number here would be 4, unless otherwise indicated by Mass DEP on your water quality sample schedule for a community system that may only have 1 school. So we've added a table here. This helps especially for those systems that are batching out samples, and if you get your school data and your resident data on a different day. So what you're going to do is you're going to fill out whether this notice is going out to residents or schools. So if it was for a resident, you'd enter age. The date that you received the data, let's just pretend, July 1st, 2020. Now let's say you did consumer notification on You're really, really efficient because you had all your paperwork ready and you had that really awesome lead and copper sampling checklist. So you're on the ball and you did it right away within 2 days. The last column, you'll indicate whether or not you made your consumer notification within 30 days. Your answer would be yes. Now, similarly, if you were not organized and you lost track of what was going on and you did your consumer notification late, say 45 days, you would have to answer N here of whether or not your notification was made within 30 days. And if that is the case, you could finish the word off for NON because unfortunately that would constitute a violation and a notice of noncompliance would be issued. So 30 days from receipt of data, consumer notification. Don't wait, just get it done. The delivery method for community systems can be either US mail, hand direct delivery, or email, which requires prior Mass DEP approval. For the schools and early education facilities, those LCCA samples, you can use US mail or direct hand delivery to the school. Now, NTNCs will fill out section C. The table is filled out exactly the same way. The date the lab data was received, the date that the notification was delivered, and so forth. But the delivery methods are different for an NTNC. So either you post it or you do direct hand delivery. If you are a school that is a PWS, you have to also follow the requirements of Part C, which is either this notification was sent home with each school or child, or it was posted on the facility's website. If you check off that the consumer notification is posted on the facility website, you can rest assured that someone from Mass DEP reviewing your form is going to actually go to this URL and make sure that the posting is there. Section D, you'll just review what you are, what the mandatory criteria is and check off all the boxes that apply, which should be all of them. If you use Mass DEP's templates, you will have all of the required parts of the consumer notification and delivery here. The contact info for your water system, the explanation of the health effects, those two definitions that we discussed, and the results. Finally, you just want to review that you have met all the mandatory criteria and check off the boxes. Now, you will see the second box here. This is very important. You must attach an example of the exact consumer notification that was delivered via the methods that you certified. So if you are sending a notification to the homeowners, you will have to give an example of one of those letters that was actually sent to the homeowners. If you are an NTNC, you must submit exactly what was posted in the NTNC. That means if you chose that second option of just reporting the 90th percentile, then you must have the analytical report for all of the sample locations attached to that posting. That must be received by Mass DEP no later than 90 days, along with this form from the end of the monitoring period. The school results, if you were a community water system that submitted, that was sampling 2 taps from 2 schools, and you need to submit the copy of your school notification template as well. All right, so that handles the forms and concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now. Whether they came in through the chat or if you have questions for myself or Kathy and you weren't comfortable putting them in the chat, feel free to raise your hand and you can be unmuted to answer the question.
Okay, Amy, I got some from the chat.
Okay, Bob.
Okay, first one. For the 90th percentile form, if the samples for Q3 were taken in August, the 90th percentile is due October 10th, not the 10th of the following month when the samples were taken, right? That's the end of the sample period, I imagine, right?
Yes, so if, let's go back. Oh, here we go.
There it is, yep. Yep, that's accurate right there.
Yep, here's your answer right here. The
Good.
data in the 90th percentile are due the 10th of the month following the monitoring period.
Good.
So that's why I think this slide is really useful. So you don't get confused on the other water quality data is the 10th of the month following collection, so this is a very useful slide to print out.
Okay, question 19 here says, if a customer collects a sample but does not get it ready until 14 days later, would it be helpful would the water system be able to acidify the samples? Absolutely not. Okay, you are violating the laboratory's quality control program by doing so. So do not acidify a water sample yourself.
The lab must acidify the samples.
Yes, please don't do that.
In the event, I'll just reiterate that. In the event that a homeowner, say, collected a sample on July 1st and didn't notify you until July 16th to come pick up the bottle, that sample would have to be invalid. That sample would not be analyzed. That sample needs to be resampled because it exceeded the 14-day time frame for acidification.
Yeah.
If they called you on, if they sampled on July 1st and they called you on July 13th, you have a day to get that to the lab and have the lab acidify it for you.
Correct. It has to be the lab.
Yes.
Okay,
sorry, Bob. This is where, when I mentioned timely pickup of bottles is important.
Okay, number 20. What happens if the customers do not fill out the chain of custody correctly or at all? Well,
so the bottle should not be accepted without a chain of custody.
Or properly filled out. Correct. So, and this is where I said that before sampling, it really helps to send the chain of custody form and the directions out to your sampling participants so that they are familiar with the form and they know exactly what is expected of them. Especially if you're on triennial sampling, because it may be somebody's first time sampling. It could have been, it doesn't matter if it's triennial or it's semi-annual or not. People move and new people move in. So it could be a different person that's going to be collecting the sample, and they will have no idea what's going on when this sample bottle shows up on their doorstep. Okay, next one, which I don't know this one. Does DEP offer chain of custodies and directions in multiple languages? Don't know.
I think we do have translation staff. If Yvette is on the call, would she be able to answer that question?
This is Andrew. I just messaged with Jessica about this. I think for a variety of reasons that we will start an effort to provide at least the chain of custody and sampling instructions in multiple languages. It'll help us with our efforts to address EJ communities, et cetera. So yeah, we will work on that. We do not, I don't believe we have any yet, but it's a great idea, great suggestion.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Andrew.
Okay, next one. Let's see, how do we properly fill out the 90th percentile when we take 62 samples instead of 60? Similar to the other one you showed in your demonstration. Yeah, so 62 times 0.9 comes out to be 55.8. So 56 would be the right answer, right?
Yes, and you would need, so the form LCRD only accommodates 60 samples. You'd have to have a separate form that lists numbers 61 and 62.
Right.
And you would indicate that as form 1 of 2, form 2 of 2 on the bottom of those forms.
Okay, next one. You got a system that's required to take 5 samples. They have alternate sample locations and had a similar situation where they got 6 samples back instead of 5. Would they have to use the LCRD form instead of the LCRE form?
Correct.
Okay, good.
Because the LCRE form only accommodates 5 samples.
Correct. That's what I thought too. Okay, good. I think that's the last one. Okay, I got 2 more questions. I'll pop up here. Who do I ask if I would like to do my customer notification by email this year? That would have to be the regional staff, I take it, correct?
Correct.
Okay, that answers that one. Question 24, can we fill out names and addresses ahead of time on the chain of custody?
You could fill out the customer name and address ahead of time if you are certain that that bottle is going to end up at that address.
Right. At that location, right?
It's sometimes best to just let the homeowner fill out the name and address. But I've certainly seen it done both ways.
Do you suggest collecting more than the required quantity? Do you suggest collecting more than, so we just said again, some alternatives in case some don't get filled out correctly? In other words, if you had to take 40, do you want to send 45 out? I guess that's what they're trying to ask.
I guess however your PWS wants to manage the fact that they might not get all the bottles back, but you have to keep in mind use of an alternative site is only acceptable if it's of the same tier and if the primary site that it's replacing did not have a previous action level exceedance. So always you would try to first obtain samples from your approved primary locations.
That brings up a point I have a question on is if you get one site that is above the action level and they're contacted to take a next sample and they don't want to do it anymore, what happens?
Excuse me, and that's where that highest tier site comes into play. The highest tier location form comes into play. That location may need to be replaced on the sampling plan. You would have to contact Mass DEP office. We need to see that effort and correspondence was made with that person that's refusing to sample.
Okay. Thanks, Amy.
Earlier, people were looking for contact information for the regions. On the bottom of the lead and copper sampling checklist, you can see the DEP staff here in the regions that you can contact if you need any type of technical assistance or have any questions regarding lead and copper. We'd be more than happy to help you with forms, questions about sampling, and so forth. We're always available for technical assistance and any additional guidance you might need in filling out any of the forms we've discussed.
Okay, hearing no questions.
Thank you, everybody.
I want to thank everyone, and for the staff, DEP staff, this was quite a good sized presentation, doing almost 200 people. So I think it was a pretty well put together program, and I thank everybody's effort for getting this together, and I hope it was good for you guys as operators. I know this is a very difficult regulation. There's a lot of moving parts, and so make sure you follow what we've given you.